Hi everyone, welcome back. So I really wanted to address a lot of this discord going on within the goth community, and I thought, what better way than to tell you a story? So the story is from when I was back in high school. And when I was in high school, I happened to attend one of the biggest high schools in the nation, and they had to separate it between two campuses. We had North and South Campus, and in North Campus we had 11th and 12th grade, South Campus, 9th and 10th. And in ninth and 10th grade, it was absolute pandemonium. And then, of course, it was almost serenity over at North, which is very strange because there was just some sort of temperament shift that occurred in the transition between North and South. So it was very strange, but it happened nonetheless. So my very first year at South, I was in ninth grade. I was 14 years old, and we had something called Beat the Freak Week. And it was basically exactly the way it sounds. It was anybody that was of the alternative genre were basically subject to violent assaults. This was not pushing, this was not shoving, this was not bullying. There were people getting airlifted to hospitals. Teachers, faculty, they had no idea how to handle the situation. And there was actually a point, I believe like 3 or 4 days in, where they rounded up all of the alternative kids and they got us all into the auditorium and locked us in with some teachers and obviously in there to keep an eye on us. And while we were in there, I remember there were people banging on the doors trying to get in from the outside to get at us, and it was the most bizarre thing I'd ever experienced. Now, the violence had there were no barriers. They didn't discriminate whether you were male or female. There were males that were just basically going after and attacking female students. There was even a disgusting case where there were guys that were actually masturbating into cups and then throwing it into the face of girls who they considered freaks. Parents were terrified for the welfare of their kids, so they were actually pulling them out of school. And for those of us who remained, a lot of the parents were begging their kids to dye their hair a normal color, dress differently, and then even news outlets were picking it up. I remember there being news stories, in newspapers, on TV, and it got actual attention. It was so bad. And finally, after I would say maybe 3 or 4 weeks, it started to die down, and then things went back to normal. But it wasn't ever really quite the same. But it was a brutal time. A lot of people think that, when you're in the alternative scene as it is today, you don't really get that much adversity. A lot of people have a lot more of a tolerance to that sort of thing. It's not out of the norm. But back in the 90s, when I went to school, it wasn't like that. And in the 80s, I can imagine it was probably much worse if that's what we got in the 90s. Now, this is not just peer-on-peer discrimination. I remember actually quite clearly, I was going to see KMFDM with a group of friends at Roseland in New York City. I think this is 1995. And as the group of us were walking toward the venue, we were all sort of dressed the same. We had black lipstick, ripped tights, 20-hole Doc Martens. And as we're walking, I see a businessman, on the street walking toward us. Now, normally, he wouldn't have stuck out in my mind if it wasn't for what he'd said. Now, as he's approaching us, I see he has a look of utter disgust, and he's looking us up and down. And as he passed us, he says, "Fucking freaks, it's not Halloween." I was just like, the fuck? But this is something that we had to come to get used to. And it was something that was very normal back then because we weren't met with the same sort of treatment that people are met with today for being different. There's always been a sort of mysterious nature that surrounded the whole goth scene. But back in the day when I went to school and, in the early 90s to mid 90s, it was not met with the same curiosity that it's met with today. Back then, it was actually met with aggression and brute force and bullying. We were not liked, and we were called freaks. It was bad. It was a brutal time, and people really got their asses handed to them on more than one occasion. Over the years, there was a major shift that had taken place where we were bullied and discriminated against. We were all of a sudden, we were feared. And we were branded as murderers and as Satanists because there were a lot of murders that had taken place by so-called goths, and they actually had thrust the goth scene into the spotlight as a result of it. One of them, most notably, the Columbine shootings. And I remember the weekend after the Columbine shootings, there were news outlets at the goth clubs on that very weekend. And I remember going into these clubs, and there were newscasters outside. There was Eyewitness News. There was a ton of them. And they all wanted to interview goths as they were coming in or going out of the clubs. And luckily, there were some level-headed goths in full attire trying to address the situation and really try to dispel these rumors that we were Satanists, that we were murderers. Another case was Roderick Farrell, who had formed a vampire cult, and he had murdered his girlfriend's parents. That gained quite a bit of attention as well. There was also a boy who was also considered part of the Gothic subculture by the name of Andrew Dulesky, and he had murdered his neighbor's wife. And all of this made the news. And this all happened around the same period. And it got to the point where it was so bad that Goths actually needed a spokesperson. And Voltaire stood to the task, and he actually very eloquently and very succinctly explained the Gothic subculture and tried his absolute best to dispel these rumors. And I think he did a really great job. And I'm actually going to show you that news story right now.
Lise, do me a favor, stand by. Scott Dylesky is being described as being involved with the goth movement, but what exactly is that? We kind of know it when we see it, but some aspects of a goth lifestyle could they provoke such a murder? Joining me now from Portland, Oregon, I believe you're in Oregon. Hi there, is Voltaire, the author of What is Goth? There's your book right there, Voltaire. And good of you to join us tonight. Voltaire, what is goth?
Oh. It can be a very complicated question because there is a lot to goth. But the simple answer is that goth is a kind of music that grew out of punk rock in the late 70s. Punk rock was a very angry kind of music that says, I don't like this world, it makes me angry and I want to destroy it. And goth was sort of the melancholy cousin of punk that says there's a lot of evil in this world, there's a lot of very mean-spirited people, and that makes me sad. And that is, you know, it's an oversimplification perhaps. Goth also tends to address the human condition. It's sort of the new romanticism. It's an appreciation for things that are romantic and passionate and sometimes dark or melancholy.
Okay, well, and Voltaire, we see a rather dark and melancholy shot of the defendant, Scott Dylesky. Is this a goth look?
You can argue that that's a goth look. I think there's so many goth looks that it certainly doesn't come down to one. But, you know, the thing is that, you know, when I look at the screen and I see that it says goth murder, I wonder to myself if he was an enthusiast of country, if he was an enthusiast of rap, would this be a rap murder? Would this be a country murder? There's obviously something about goth that is very mysterious to most people who are not exposed to it, which makes them believe that there's something, I guess, especially dangerous about goths, which to me seems fairly silly.
It is kind of a broad term. It's kind of like punk, and a lot of people associate a lot of things with it. Is there, in some aspects of the goth movement, a satanic quality anywhere out there in the goth world? Did you explore that in your book?
You know, there may very well be people within the goth scene, because the goth scene really encompasses a lot of different tribes of people, and there are some who may very well be Satanists, but there are also Satanists who are CEOs, and there are Satanists who are farmers, and again, there isn't really a direct correlation between goth and Satanism. I would say most of the goths I know are Christians, Jewish. I've met a few Muslim ones. I've met a few born-again Christian goths, and probably to a large degree, a lot of them are secular.
All right, Voltaire. Well, I think you're probably the first goth I've met, and it was good chatting with you tonight. Thanks.
My pleasure.
All right.
I think the fact that the Gothic subculture actually needed a spokesperson to come out and speak in their behalf speaks volumes as to how bad things had actually gotten. Now, obviously, all of that's died down. We're no longer bullied for being goth, and we're no longer considered psychopathic killers. However, what's happened now is it's spawned a new generation of goth-on-goth bullying, which is absolutely ridiculous, because after all that we went through to basically maintain who we are and maintain our identity, we now have these people who are taking on the same mentality of those during Beat the Freak Week, those trying to intimidate us out of being who we are. That is the mentality that you should have. Go against the grain, screw what anybody else says, and if you want to get away from these people, all you have to do is log off. Regardless of the threat of beatdowns, regardless of the news outlets branding us as psychopaths, we never cowed to intimidation. It never stopped us from remaining steadfast to our own subculture. And that being said, neither should you. Considering what we went through, you can obviously imagine how this goth-on-goth bullying thing is utterly infuriating. So all you younger goths, go out there, explore. We didn't put up with that bullshit for nothing. And as for you elitist trolls that live online, go make out with a 9-volt battery.